I'm Connor Old, and welcome back to another episode of Old's Oscar Countdown. And this week we're going to be looking at 3 categories. Once again, a sort of massive episode looking at different categories. This week is going to be fun because as we're releasing the video, the Makeup and Hairstyling Guilds have been announced, and about probably tomorrow or the next day, the SAG Award nominations are going to be coming out, and I'm going to give my reactions and analysis in a separate video for that. So a lot of Oscars content this week. Decided to do the sort of design categories like I do every single week. You guys usually appreciate that, so please continue to show your support. You guys have been doing a really fantastic job this year, so please comment below. Let me know your thoughts. I'd love to hear it in the comments below. But without further ado, let's first jump into the Best Production Design category, and my first pick is going to go to Dune. Now, this movie is a bit of a technical marvel. I think a lot of people are likening the movie to a Mad Max Fury Road or a Dunkirk, and I feel similarly. I think a lot of people see this as a sort of large sci-fi fantasy epic that does all the technical things very well. This is from filmmaker Denis Villeneuve, whose previous movies have been appreciated in this category. A movie like Arrival and Blade Runner 2049 have been nominated in this category, so there's already a built-in appreciation for his films. Now you have a movie that could be contending for Best Picture, could get in for Best Director, a big sort of sci-fi epic that mixes visual effects, multiple locations, real life sets, going to the desert, but also sort of the mix of real life actually building of sets, but also mixing that in with visual effects to extend it, and really sort of feels like a cohesive vision, I think. And I think a lot of people appreciate that in the same way they appreciate Mad Max for building its very unique world. I think Dune, essentially filming this unadaptable book that they've been trying to sort of redo ever since David Lynch's version, and I think sort of seemingly have nailed it. Big success at the box office. Like I said, I expect it to be nominated in a bunch of categories, but with the main part being that production design. And then my second nominee, I went with West Side Story. Now this is from Adam Stockhausen, who does a lot of Wes Anderson's movies, and he's actually won for a Wes Anderson movie, Grand Budapest Hotel, and we may be speaking about him later, but as of right now, my second pick is West Side Story for a similar reason to Dune. I think this may be a similar path to Dune. I think Steven Spielberg gets in for director. I think this gets in for picture. I think this gets a lot of technical appreciation. Not as much as Dune, but I do think it does get the appreciation, particularly in something like screenplay, where Dune may not get it, and potentially even 3 acting nominations. So I see this as a very well liked, very well nominated movie. I think the positive sign of the movie is that it's starting to pick back up in terms of the box office, that it's not sort of labeled a complete failure, that it did sort of have legs throughout the Christmas market, which is what you want to see. But this will get nominated, I think, in Best Production Design because this is a big budgeted movie musical. Of course, you have the real life sets of New York City, but also the sort of sets that are reminiscing of the past, original West Side Story and the play, but also sort of reinventing them and reimagining them. You have iconic sort of these built large sets like the alleyway where Tony and Maria first meet, but also sort of fighting amongst the ruins of the sort of where they're going to build the Lincoln Center, and the parallels there. So a lot of the movie is paid attention to these sort of large sets, using CGI to extend it, but there is a lot of sort of large built sets with all these dancers in these large contained spaces, but also mixing that in to the realistic sort of real location elements. And I think this movie is going to be very well liked. Plus it has a lot of these sort of larger sets, and we've seen this in production design, that building these sort of large sets or interesting use of miniatures, less so say like CGI or just shooting in rooms. The production design, especially designers, especially when it incorporates so well within the movie, I think really appreciate the actual building of the sets, and the variation is another important factor. 2 things which West Side Story has. And then my third pick, I'm going to go with Nightmare Alley. Now, I know this movie has been sort of falling in a lot of ways. It seems to be already forgotten at the box office year-end lists. It has positive reviews, but not maybe capital A great reviews. So it could be technically in the consideration for Best Picture, but right now it seems to be, for the most part, a sort of technical sort of a movie. And I think that this is a category that ultimately it will do well in, for the most part, because Guillermo del Toro was the director of this movie, and his movies in particular are very well focused on the production production design. That, as a matter of fact, if you look at all the critical reviews, even if there's sort of a mixed bag in terms of the reviews or the appreciation of the movie, I think everyone appreciates at the very least the design of the movie, the production design, the first part, how it's we get a sort of backstage understanding of the carnival and all the different sets that you have hit there, and then as the story unfolds and we get into a little bit more of a high, classy, sophisticated world, it changes, and there's a lot of reminiscence of noir movies, so there's an appreciation to the past there. Of course, like I mentioned, there is a lot of these sort of built sets, and the director, Guillermo del Toro, his last movie, The Shape of Water, won in this category. One of his other films, Pan's Labyrinth, also won in this category. So his films almost always get recognized or appreciated in the production design category, and I think because Nightmare Alley is a movie that's in the conversation, maybe not get Best Picture, but I do think we'll get multiple technical nominations, just because in the conversation, just because people are watching it because it's being campaigned. I think at the very least, this movie gets nominated for Best Production Design. And then my fourth pick, I went with The French Dispatch, which I mentioned in West Side Story. This is also done by Adam Stockhausen, who won Best Production Design Award for the Grand Budapest Hotel. And this movie is not like the Grand Budapest Hotel in the sense that I think it's going to get multiple Oscar nominations and wins. I think this is a movie that's not as well liked as Wes Anderson's past live-action movie. Seems sort of vignette-y, lacks a little bit of that emotional core. But that being said, I think there's still, like Nightmare Alley maybe, a technical appreciation, a real strong appreciation for Wes Anderson's work, and particularly in this movie, what he's doing with visuals and his experimentation with it, and the fact that you have these three anthology stories, as well as the sort of interconnectivity of the actual French Dispatch, The Office there. Wes Anderson's style is so unique, and much to do about that is these sort of sets. So you have varying locations within different stories. You have varying sets. You also have, one anthology in particular, set in a prison in which there's a fresco. So attention to detail of the environment of the wall, the production design. Wes's movies often get sort of recognized in this category and win in the case of Grand Budapest Hotel because of how specific and clear they are. So French Dispatch, maybe they think, okay, we're going to give it to Adam for West Side Story, but I think it's going to be a movie that enough people have seen and will appreciate the technical love just because of how visually interesting it is. And then the concern of the movie for me is that this is not going to be a movie that's nominated for Best Picture. And I think it's important to note that this Best Production Design category is oftentimes tied to the Best Picture. If you look at the sort of past 10 years, which I did, there's an average of 1.8. So let's round to two movies that are nominated in the Best Production Design category that are not nominated for Best Picture. So there really has to be sort of an appreciation. So we do get, Tenet last year or Mary Poppins Returns when there's a strong appreciation for it. I do think French Dispatch fits into that slot. However, that does affect my fifth slot, and my fifth slot ultimately goes to Belfast. So sort of transitioning into that conversation, I could have gone with The Tragedy of Macbeth or Cyrano, my possible contenders in this fifth slot, but I went with Belfast ultimately because of that connection between production design and Best Picture. You see, I am not exactly sure Nightmare Alley gets in. I'm not exactly sure, French Dispatch I don't think has a chance. Nightmare Alley at least has a chance, but let's say those two movies don't get in. Well, then do we really think there are going to be 3 production design nominees that are not nominated for Best Picture? Ultimately, you have to remember that movies that are well-liked by a lot of people, including the Best Picture category, are well-liked by many times the guilds and other people within the Academy. So if you like Belfast, even though it's not necessarily a particularly production design heavy, screaming at you kind of a movie, it is a movie that sometimes gets recognized. I mean, we've seen The Shape of Water win Best Picture. That won production design. Roma gets nominated for Best Production Design. La La Land, almost contender nominated for production design. So we see these movies that win Best Picture or almost win Best Picture also get nominated for production design. So there's a correlation there, which is why I went with Belfast in the number 5 slot. Personally, my Best Picture frontrunner. This is a well-liked movie. It's also, in terms of the production design, at this small community, so the house is very recognizable, the locations are very clear, just that sort of main street. So much of the movie has to do with community and place, which I do think will resonate with the production designers, because so much of the strength of the movie is the setting of Belfast that is very sort of replicated well. I mentioned Roma. This has oftentimes been compared to Roma in the sense that it's this black and white historical kind of a period piece movie, but also has a sort of strong connection to place. And Roma got nominated. Like I mentioned before, Parasite is also a movie that wins Best Picture, also gets, in my opinion, kind of a surprise nomination for Best Production Design, just because those movies are very well liked. I think Belfast is a movie that's very well liked. It does make sense in certain elements that this is still a period piece, that this has a very communal aspect. The street is very well rendered, but also with a sort of certain checkpoints that we're starting to see enter into Belfast. There are some interesting production design elements, which is ultimately why I went with that 5th slot, combined with the fact that I think it's going to get in for Best Picture, and this category has a strong tie-in to Best Picture. So am I really going to go with three, movies that I don't think are going to get nominated for Best Picture? Hard to tell right now. For example, if Nightmare Alley starts to get into more and more conversations and seems to be more of a sure thing for Best Picture, may feel more confident going with a Cyrano or a Tragedy of Macbeth in this category. But right now, the way things are panning out, I think Nightmare Alley is just and the French Dispatch themselves are strong sort of non-Best Picture nominees. But then in that fifth slot, you got to go with something that's Best Picture related, and for me, the one that makes the most sense is Belfast. So like I mentioned, my first possible contender is going to be the Tragedy of Macbeth. I'm more of a Best Picture believer in this movie than most, which may even help its chances of getting in. This is very much I would call it a Passion of Joan of Arc kind of a production design approach. It's shot in black and white. The settings are very sparse. This is not shot outside. This is very much shot on a sound stage. You'll see some sand on the ground, but for the most part, the backgrounds are all sort of foggy within these sort of very simplistic rooms, and add to some of the more artistic, abstract approaches to what they do with the Tragedy of Macbeth. And the production design, at the very least, is noticeable and is very unique. And I think some people will really appreciate that, and some people won't, but I think just because it's so unique, so different, because the challenge was to make something so evocative with using such simplistic, just a single pillar, single column. How are you going to design a door if that's the only thing? You don't have to rely on going to Ireland in some castle. You have to build it. And this feels very much like a stage play. So that could be sort of used against it because it's very simplistic, or people could really like it because of how unique it is. At the very least, I do think it is very unique, and I think that ultimately in these categories, the most unique or the most noticeable score, the most noticeable editing, the most noticeable costumes, these are the types of movies that get nominated, and the production design of the Tragedy of Macbeth is definitely noticeable, I think. Then my final possible contender, I went with Cyrano, and like I mentioned, this is maybe just on the outside for me because I'm not exactly sure about its chances. I don't think it gets in for Best Picture. Ultimately, I'm concerned over its chances in general. I think it's maybe right now going to disappoint in some of these technical categories. I'm a little bit conflicted because on one hand, I think just not enough people have seen it, and maybe it's breaking late, and maybe it'll resonate that way. But in terms of the Oscar shortlist, I was very surprised to not get shortlisted for Best Song. It did not get shortlisted for Best Score. If we see someone like Peter Dinklage slip, maybe the movie just isn't as well liked as we thought. So there's going to be some interesting things, I think, ultimately to see along the way. Does Dinklage sort of get that appreciation? And if not, maybe this movie just isn't doing so well. The one sort of caveat is that the production designers are Katie Spencer and Sarah Greenwood, and these are two production designers who have been nominated 6 times, many times for Joe Wright's works in this category. So Joe Wright has an appreciation for this, and his films have a strong emphasis towards this. So just the fact that these are two very well appreciated production designers who have been nominated together 6 times, many times for these Joe Wright movies, Cyrano could have that sort of surprise nomination. So in many ways, I think I may feel more confident putting this in than something like Belfast if we see a movie like Nightmare Alley get a little bit more Best Picture steam. But like I said, I am still worried about the overall love of the movie. Okay, now jumping over into Best Costume Design, my first pick has to be Cruella. Now, oftentimes in these categories, particularly in the Best Costume category, if you're a movie about costumes or fashion, it really helps your movie. We've seen movies like Phantom Thread win this category before, or other movies get nominated because they're kind of about fashion, about making clothing, and Cruella is the sort of prime example. This is a big budget Disney movie. You may think, oh, this is not a real sort of contender, but I do think it is in the technical categories. It is being campaigned that way. It is largely, a well-watched and seen Disney movie, and one of the more appreciated of the Disney remakes. Of course, this is also a movie about a wannabe sort of costume designer, and Cruella doing all the different unique costumes that she has within her movie. And then particularly in the costume design category, you have to remember is that the costume designers, similarly to something like Best Score, are oftentimes well noted. In the sound category, we don't see oftentimes repeat nominees always, or they're less known, or there's like 3 or 4 people nominated. But in costume design, oftentimes there's just one person nominated, and many times there are many sort of legends, the Sandy Powells, the Mary Joffreys, the Colleen Atwoods, who have won 3, 4 Oscars, nominated a bunch. Really appreciate costume designers. So oftentimes the name behind this category really helps. Who's the name behind Cruella? Jenny Bevan. This is a 10-time nominee, 2-time winner costume designer whose work goes all the way back to the Merchant Ivory films, but more recently has won for something like Mad Max Fury Road. So she's still a very well-respected costume designer and could win for this category. But I'm just so confident in this getting nominated because A, it's got the movie. It's got the fact that this is a movie about costume designers and making your own clothes and that kind of path and that passion, which I think will resonate a lot, of course, because it's the costume designers branch. And then 2, Jenny Bevan, who is a very well-appreciated costume designer. There's so many different costume changes and outfits and recreating that iconic iconography. Plus, the movie is about that. So ultimately, it just seems like a slam dunk. Cruella, as soon as I saw it, I knew I was going to get nominated for costumes, and I bet my money that it would. Then in my second pick, I went with Spencer. So, while Cruella has Jenny Bevan, this has Jacqueline Duran, a 2-time winner, and I believe 7-time nominee. She won most recently just a couple of years ago for Little Women, and she's sort of known for having these period piece, big 18th century kind of dresses. And this one is much more modern, but still connected to the royals, in this case of Princess Diana. So we have many times the big dresses of the uniqueness. And then we also have, real life footage. So there's recreating outfits as well. There's, I think, a clear demarcation point within the movie where you sort of have casual Diana and Princess Diana, and that kind of costume almost sort of eating her alive. Of course, there's also a direct connection in the movie itself, in which Princess Diana, a key character in the movie, is sort of her dresser, played by Sally Hawkins. So there is right there a connection between, connecting to a dresser, a designer, there's a prominent designer figure, really her best friend played in the movie. So there's sort of that connection with costume designers that I think they will appreciate. Also, like I said, recreating a lot of iconic costumes and dresses, which is very interesting. You have the casual side, you also have the big iconic dresses, very beautiful pastel color palette, and it's something iconic when we think of the movie. I often think of the kind of costumes and dressings of the royal family and the sort of extravagance of that from somebody who is a very well appreciated costume designer. Like I said at the very beginning of this award season, I think Spencer is going to follow the same path as Jackie, the other troubled royal-like figure by the same director, released in 2016, and that got nominated for Best Costumes, and I think this will too. Now, it is worth noting that this movie kind of surprised and did not get a Critics' Choice nomination. However, personally, the appreciation for Jacqueline Duran in her 7 nominations, in her 2 wins, is really strong. Plus, the movie, if we do think Kristen Stewart is the frontrunner to win for Best Lead Actress at the Oscars, I think costume design will sort of ultimately fall in place. However, it's notable that it just didn't show up there. Kind of hard to explain, but I'm still not doubting it. I think that was just a bit of a slip-up, and I think Spencer just makes too much sense, frankly. And then my third nomination, seemingly an almost kind of a slam dunk as well in terms of a nomination, we have House of Gucci, about the Gucci fashion house, and that in and of itself seems to make sense to me that it would get nominated. The movie used real Gucci clothing, so there's some real beautiful pieces of clothing here, and many of the movie traits and appeals is just that you get to see these movie stars in these beautiful clothing in Europe in these different locations. Now, this is from costume designer Janty Yates, who has won an Oscar before for Gladiator. However, that was her only nomination. I don't think that's too much of a thing to hold against her, because yes, she has won, but also she works on every Ridley Scott movie, so she is a very well appreciated and acclaimed costume designer. Even though she hasn't necessarily been nominated every time, she hasn't had this sort of classic example here, so she's still a veteran within the industry. And then you have the content of the film itself about dresses and designing within the movie, in the same way Phantom Thread was kind of about that. You have the beautiful Gucci clothing of the men, but also the women too, in this case of Lady Gaga, and then changing how that sort of changes throughout the decades, but also, seeing Lady Gaga in when she's a little bit poorer, what she wears there versus how that changes and her style changes. So the movie's all about style, it's all about fashion. The costume designers, I think, will have to sort of recognize and be in love with this movie, and I'd be surprised if it doesn't get nominated, just because it has the content, has the talent behind it too, and I think will resonate ultimately with costume designers because of the varying amount of costumes made by, of course, the legendary fashion house of Gucci. Then in my fourth slot, once again, I have gone with Dune. Now, out of all the technical categories, I think this is probably the most vulnerable, just because it doesn't necessarily have costumes right away as something that sort of jumps out at you. But if we're believing that this is a sort of Mad Max Fury Road-esque kind of a movie, it's just going to get nominated in a bunch of categories, including something like costumes. Now, personally, I have it lower on here just because it's not directly about a costume designer or costumes in some way, like the first three movies are. That being said, we've seen the sort of sci-fi category do very well in costumes, which sometimes you have to challenge conventional wisdom. I fall into this trap too sometimes, but I'm sure you're up there thinking, oh, costumes, right? That's going to be like these big, puffy, 18th century kind of movies. They normally do well. And yes, they do normally do well and often get nominated and oftentimes win. But recently, we've actually seen more of a trend towards sci-fi movies and fantasy movies also doing very well. I mentioned Jenny Bevan. She won for Mad Max Fury Road for Best Costumes. Not only did she get nominated, she won. Want to talk about something like Black Panther with Ruth E. Carter? She won for that movie, which is a movie that's not directly necessarily about costumes. Of course, has beautiful costumes in it, but is very much, a sci-fi fantasy movie. I think Dune will sort of fall into the similar trap and trajectory. Of course, we have the differing costumes based on the differing houses. The Baroness looks very different than the House Atreides, and there's some Momoa sort of unique armor, and there's different types of armor. Of course, you have this sort of more militaristic, casual outfits within House Atreides, but just distinguishing the different clans in many ways is clear because of the demarcations within their outfits and the way they sort of approach that. So you have this sort of realistic, more militaristic kind of a side in the human characters, but also some more abstract, especially even something like the Zendaya's characters, Javier Bardem, and their people, the sort of dusty, worn, very practical use of the costumes. So I think that will be appreciated. I think this could be a movie that could potentially even win, but right now I'm just having it at the bottom in terms of the fourth slot because it doesn't scream at you, jump out at you, costumes, this is a costumes movie. In the same way it does, this is a visual effects movie, this is a cinematography movie. Those things, at least for me, sort of jump out right away. But I do think this is going to be a movie that is appreciated in that sci-fi kind of realm in the same way Mad Max was, in the same way Black Panther was. So don't forget about that. The costumes aren't all about dresses. Sometimes they're about sci-fi too. And in recent years, they've been proving that to us. And then in my final slot, I went with West Side Story because when I don't think of necessarily costumes for Dune, I still have it getting in because of the appreciation of the technical elements of the movie. When I do think of West Side Story, frankly, I do think of the costumes. I think of Aaron Boys and the America sequence and her bright colors. I think of the sort of iconics, in terms of the original West Side Story, that movie won for Best Costume Design because there's sort of a clear demarcation point between the sort of reds and the purples of the sharks, but also versus these sort of yellows and greens of the jets. And there's sort of a clear demarcation point and differentiation used through the colors. Now, this movie does less so of that, and I think to better effect because you can see the similarities. But that being said, there's still these sort of iconic moments. Just for example, Maria, she has this beautiful white dress, and what does she do? She puts a nice red kind of ribbon around her waist, and it sort of makes it just so much better. Iconic, clean, classic, reminiscent of the classic West Side Story movie, which won Best Picture, but also sort of unique in that sense as well. It's not uncommon for a musical to get nominated in this category. La La Land's been nominated, Chicago won, Moulin Rouge. So there is a sort of lineage of musicals getting nominated, and just for the sheer amount of actors that they have with the beautiful colors, and it's a beautiful color movie, and oftentimes that comes through the dresses, through the sort of prom sequence, and the stuff that's going on there, and the sort of rough and tumble of the gangs and their sort of simple wife beaters is really, I think, a sophisticated job. This is from Paul Tazwell, who's mostly a theater guy, did Hamilton and things like that, but I think is sort of up and coming. And in this category, you don't need all sort of established people. He's not that established person, but I think is connected to this technical marvel of West Side Story. So if we do think this is a sort of big Oscar contender, picture, director, acting, I think it'll also get in for costume design because it's a musical, because there's so many different varying costumes, and because the costumes are so bright and varying and in your face in a terrific way. Then some possible contenders. My first one being Cyrano. Like I mentioned, the production design part of this video, hard to tell exactly how well Cyrano is going to perform because it didn't get that song shortlist or the score shortlist. Is it because the movie's not very well liked, or is it just because not enough people have seen the movie? Hard to see, but I do think this is something that we should consider for costumes because it could be a secret dark horse. The costume designer that's credited on the movie is Massimo Parini, who just sort of recently last year got nominated for Best Costume Design for Pinocchio, which is an Italian movie that very few people have seen, and I was surprised that it got nominated for costume design. So what does that tell us? It tells us this is a very well-respected costume designer. And when we have Cyrano, which is a little bit more American and should be seen by more members of the Academy, that could be even more dangerous. So we have already a celebrated costume designer, but then that's the credited costume designer. As a matter of fact, if you go digging and you look at the for-your consideration page, you also see that Jacqueline Duran is credited for designing the costumes for Roxanne, one of the characters in the film, the sort of main female character. So that's very interesting that they're putting her name along with it, that she could get nominated along with this movie. Now, if she didn't have something like Spencer, I think that would benefit this movie because she, like I said before, 7-time nominee, 2-time winner. But because she has Spencer, I do think that's going to get her in for there. Less so, I think, will help Cyrano in this case, but it always helps to have someone like Jacqueline Duran tied to your movie because she is so well respected. Musicals, like I mentioned with West Side Story, tend to get in, but Cyrano I don't see as the best picture contender, so ultimately I have it on the outside. And then my final slot, I went with Licorice Pizza, which is from another sort of acclaimed costume designer, in this case Mark Bridges, who won for Phantom Thread and has been nominated for other Paul Thomas Anderson movies like Phantom Thread, of course, and Inherent Vice. So Licorice Pizza could be like an Inherent Vice kind of a nomination because it so accurately represents and recreates the 70s period. And he'll get nominated for a movie like Joker, which isn't necessarily screaming costumes necessarily. And I think Licorice Pizza kind of fits into that similar slot. Ultimately, I think this is a dark horse and watch out contender just because Paul Thomas Anderson has been nominated very well at the Oscars. He almost overperforms in many instances. And if we think Licorice Pizza is best director, best screenplay winner, best picture, do we really think it's not going to get any acting? Do we really think it's not going to get any technicals, just director, screenplay, and picture and be a serious contender? I think there's going to be some surprise somewhere. I think costume design is actually the most potential of getting in because you have Mark Bridges, who is a past-time winner and well appreciated costume designer and has won for past Paul Thomas Anderson movies because it's sort of a period piece, because I also think that they're going to really like Licorice Pizza. So they may want to nominate somewhere, and this could be the very well place that they do. Now jumping over into the best makeup and hairstyling portion of the vid, my first nominee is going to be The Eyes of Tammy Faye. Now, the Makeup and Hairstyling Guild, they are sort of the big guild that you want to watch for because they're pretty indicative of what's going to get nominated at the Oscars. However, they have a bunch of different categories, so it's not a clear number 5. But because of that, you can see where the support sort of lies. And I'd use that to sort of influence my judgment as well as, of course, past experience, giving you high accurate predictions. And my first pick is going to be The Eyes of Tammy Faye. Now, regardless of the guilds, all you have to do is look at the past 4 or so years of Oscars and realize that the Makeup and Hairstyling Award is really the best prosthetics award. That what it really is sort of focused on the makeup. How can you sort of make an Oscar-nominated actress look not like the actual person and sort of do their makeup in an interesting way? And I think this year the one that makes the most sense is The Eyes of Tammy Faye, transforming Jessica Chastain into Tammy Faye Baker. But really, just look at the past 4 years. Viola Davis gets transformed into Ma Rainey for Ma Rainey's Black Bottom. Ma Rainey's Black Bottom wins Best Makeup. The next year, you have Bombshell winning makeup for turning Charlize Theron into Megyn Kelly. The year after that, 2018, you get Vice winning for turning Christian Bale into Dick Cheney. 2017, you have Darkest Hour winning for turning Gary Oldman into Winston Churchill. And what's the one thing that they all have in common? Well, they were all nominated the same year. So Gary Oldman, of course, won, but Christian Bale and Charlize Theron, they were all nominated for those movies in that year. So you want to sort of work backwards and go, okay, well, what's that movie of this year? And to me, the most clear one is The Eyes of Tammy Faye, because it's very likely that Jessica Chastain will get nominated, and she's playing a real-life person, in this case, Tammy Faye Baker, who is known for having this sort of extravagant makeup on herself, and Jessica Chastain extending her jaw. She really does sort of transform in her performance, but also through the prosthetics and the makeup that they put on her, and even sort of an extra little bonus, she has this sort of crazy kind of 80s hairstyle that was, typical of the time, but a little bit more outdated today. That's also added on top of it. So there's a lot of elements there. Because there's this emphasis on the makeup and the character in the film, it just seems like a natural evolution. That assuming Jessica Chastain gets nominated for Best Actress, which I do think she does, I think this gets nominated. Now, this may not end up winning, but right now I think it has the best chance because it does this extreme makeup job and because we expect Jessica Chastain to do well in terms of nominations. Then my second pick, I went with Dune. Now, like I said in the other categories, Dune is the sort of technical marvel of the year. It's going to be like a Lord of the Rings or Mad Max, which just gets nominated in a bunch of different categories. And makeup is probably, I'd say, second in terms of its likelihood of getting in, just because you have that main character of the Baron, played by Stellan Skarsgård, who is, very much this kind of otherworldly figure. They actually have shown ads, for your consideration, ads of him sort of putting on all this sort of plaster to sort of make up into this sort of overweight floating man. You also have David Bautista, who is doing his own sort of pale look of the Harkonnen. So you have all these different types of sort of looks and makeup styles, but more importantly, I think for the most part, this is just a technical marvel. That's the big thing. So I don't really think it matters in terms of whether or not this has terrific makeup, just because it's one of these movies that's so well appreciated below the line. I think people are just going to check it off and want to show their support. And then the second one being, well, it does have a pretty impressive makeup sort of character in its own, and that being the Baron, played by Stellan Skarsgård. It's not super obvious, but it is interesting and unique. And this is a sci-fi movie, which is, not a lot of makeup for a lot of the characters, but there are some sort of interesting approaches to that. And then another small thing I want to mention is that part of the team that worked on this and will be nominated, should this movie get nominated, is the same team that worked on The 100-Year-Old Man Who Climbed Outside the Window and Disappeared, and A Man Called Ove, two Swedish films, which every year there seem to be some Swedish film that we've never even heard of that gets nominated in this category. So there's people behind those movies that get nominated every year, this sort of old man makeup style, who also worked on this movie here. So there's already sort of two-time nominees, appreciation there, and they're getting nominated for movies that very few people have seen, but the makeup is so terrific in it. So I think just because it has sort of that appreciation there, plus it's a big-time sort of technical movie that's going to be campaigned, I do expect to get nominated in a bunch of categories, performed well at the Makeup and Hairstyling Guild, so no issue there. So I do expect ultimately this to get in. Then with my third pick, I'm going to go with House of Gucci. Now, this is a movie that is in the third slot, but could even win, just because, similarly to The Eyes of Tammy Faye, it has that actor connection. Jared Leto could get nominated for actor, in which he plays a real-life person and is in a transformative kind of a role, helped with the prosthetics and makeup of this movie. So this could be a movie that definitely sort of leapfrogs The Eyes of Tammy Faye, but right now, I just have The Eyes of Tammy Faye a little bit higher, because I think Jessica Chastain is a little bit more of a lock for Best Actress, at least for a nomination, than is Jared Leto. He's still a little bit on the outside for me. I mean, they took Jared Leto, one of the most handsome men on the planet, and turned him to sort of overweight and bald and looking nothing like him. I mean, let's remember when we first saw those images, he really looked nothing like Jared Leto. We were all surprised by that. And the Makeup Guild has shown in the past that they don't necessarily care about the quality of the movie, more so that they care about the makeup. So this is the movie that I think a lot of people are going to be seeing, just because it is in the Oscar conversation. We do expect a couple of other nominations at least. And it's also got terrific makeup. So because it's got that transformative role, which we've seen in the past has done very well with nominations and wins, I expect House of Gucci to get nominated. And it's also worth noting that it also got the most nominations to the Makeup and Hairstyling Guild with 3, so there's a huge support there. That shows sort of a science support, maybe even more so for the win. We'll have to see how that goes in terms of when that happens ultimately, but in terms of the nominations, I think House of Gucci is close to a lock. Then my fourth pick, I'm going to go with Cruella, which I think is going to be a movie that's a little bit underappreciated so far in terms of its performance at the Oscars. This could be a serious sort of technical awards player, and Cruella, like I mentioned in the costume design section, I think that's going to get a slam dunk nomination, but I also think it's going to get nominated here in Makeup and Hairstyling, more so for the hairstyling. That ultimately, this is a makeup guild where they love the prosthetics, but we have seen movies like Emma and 1917 do well with, in my opinion, mostly just has to do with hairstyling and sort of period detail, and Cruella is kind of the sort of London 60s pop punk aesthetic. Of course, you have the traditional iconic black and white hair of Cruella herself, and then sort of the more extravagant style that's done by the Baroness, played by Emma Thompson. So there's lots of sort of style and color in this movie, and they utilize that to very great extents. I also think this is a very popular movie. This is seen by a lot of people, so there's a good chance a lot of people have seen it and will remember it. So I'm more leaning on the fact that you have that sort of white makeup, the bright red lips, you have the sort of iconic hairstyle, and there's just different varieties of styles and fashion playing an emphasis on this movie. I think this will be more of the hairstyling version, and I do think Disney will be campaigning this movie pretty hard in these categories. And then my final pick, I'm actually going to go with Coming to America, which may be seen as sort of a strange pick, but ultimately it came down to the prosthetics work. That, like I said before, this is a guild that doesn't necessarily always care about the quality of the movie. I mean, we've seen movies like Maleficent and The Suicide Squad, the first one, get nominated and even win in this category, despite the movies being sort of critically panned. And Coming to America wasn't as well received. However, the movie does have a historic lineage and some terrific makeup work. So there's a lot of sort of prosthetics. Of course, the original Coming to America kind of invented it in the sense that Eddie Murphy was playing a bunch of different characters. Here, Eddie Murphy once again sort of plays a bunch of different characters and does so and transforms, and you can barely even tell it's Eddie Murphy because of the sort of sophistication in the prosthetics. You know, the first Coming to America was nominated for Best Makeup, so it's not necessarily going to be strange if this one also gets nominated. I also think it's worth noting that actually last year at the Makeup and Hairstyling Guild Awards, Eddie Murphy sort of got an honorary award for his sort of ability to transform in many times and work with those makeup teams on Norbit and what have you. So he is sort of a very well celebrated figure. So he's doing this once again, this kind of celebration of the different characters and utilizing and showcasing makeup. And for Amazon Prime, you know, this is a studio that we've seen campaign heavily before for movies. They don't really have sort of a main movie in the contention this year, so I think they're going to try to get some small nominations where they can, and I think they're going to be pushing Coming to America here. And just from the fact that even got a shortlist tells you that they appreciate it, they've been watching it, so it's not like it's coming out of left field. It did make the shortlist, so it is something to sort of keep an eye out for, that people are seeing it and they are appreciating it. Then some possible contenders. My first one's going to be West Side Story, just because of the strength of the movie. You know, I'm not super confident this gets in, but I also wasn't confident like a movie like 1917 would get in, but ultimately did because it was just so well liked and it was so technically appreciated. Now I have that kind of slot for Dune, and I'm going with something like Coming to America just because it has a little bit more prosthetic works, but West Side Story I still expect to be a well-liked movie, get production design, get costume design. However, I don't think of the makeup when I think of West Side Story, which is why I went with a costume design and I didn't go with makeup here, just because it's not obvious, it's not in your face, it's pretty traditional. There's many different characters and interesting hairstyles between the Jets and the Sharks and, you know, and the woman in the film. But that being said, it's not necessarily out in your face and overt. It only got one nomination at the Makeup and Hairstyling Guild, so there's a little bit of concern there as well. You know, probably should have gotten two and didn't. So because of that, it's just right now a possible contender. And then my other possible contender is the Suicide Squad, which did do well at the Makeup and Hairstyling Guild, getting the sort of two nominations it needed to get. My concern is that it didn't get even shortlisted for visual effects, which is a concern because it has a truly terrific visual effects. So maybe it gets those appreciation there. I mean, the first Suicide Squad did win in this category, so it would make sense for the Suicide Squad to get in here, but they've kind of already awarded Harley Quinn for Birds of Prey, or for, you know, the first Suicide Squad. So do they really want to reward that Harley Quinn design again? Maybe they want to. It did do well sort of preliminary at the Makeup and Hairstyling Guilds, but Coming to America did the same amount of nominations, so where are they sort of going to diverge? I went to Coming to America just because I love it more faith in the makeup, and because the movie got shortlisted, whereas, you know, something like the Suicide Squad, you know, didn't get shortlisted in an obvious category, something like the visual effects. Maybe indicates to me that not enough people have seen it, or they just don't appreciate it as much, whereas it seems like Coming to America has a sort of appreciation because it has that lineage of makeup work. But that's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure you comment below. Let me know your thoughts on my predictions. Give me your predictions in the comments down below. Subscribe to the channel. Stay tuned for the next couple days where I'm going to give my SAG nominations reactions. By the time you're watching this video, it could already have been out. So I hope you liked the video, subscribe to the channel, and appreciate the sort of deep dive analysis that I do. I know a lot of people sort of do these sort of monthly updates and barely talk about these categories, but this channel is for breaking down, getting into the nitty-gritty, telling you why Massimo Perini but is the credited costume designer, but you also have Jacqueline Duran for Cyrano. Those are the details that matter ultimately at the end, that I want to provide you for the most accurate predictions you can get. But like I said, that's about it, and until next time, stay tuned.